Hey, folks. I have been thinking and reading and thinking some more over the last day and a half about what the heck is happening in Iran right now with the U.S. and Israeli strikes there. And I've been trying to come up with some kind of unified theory of what is going on. And I wanted to pitch it at you. So here goes. If you've been watching the channel at all, I've been trying to read the actions of the Trump administration, although not just them, in terms of what I am calling Brotalitarianism, which is what I'm claiming is a kind of new phenomenon. I am saying they're not fascists. They are not traditional fascists of circa 1934. As much as they pretend they are doing that, which is part of the play. They're not fascists because the backers of this regime are not international or not. They're not national industrialists, kind of making money by building a big war machine and going out and seizing territory and resources to feed the war machine and feed the nationalist project. Rather, the backers, the money behind this, are international billionaires, what I'm calling the bros. So tech bros, finance bros, real estate bros, and so on. People basically who make their money by extracting wealth rather than producing stuff, and who gain more power to extract and more leverage by seizing new assets. And that seizure is greatly helped along by the intentional application of chaos and violence and misery. Because the more chaos, the easier it is to buy stuff up. That's basically the theory. This is important because it helps you to understand what they're doing, what the Trump administration and the bros are doing. Because the bros' goal in controlling the U.S. is it kind of in its twilight days as a global hegemon, and I think they recognize that, it's not to expand U.S. power per se. It's to use the U.S. power to make tons of money and also to break the world. And basically, after breaking the world, to buy up the pieces. And part of that project also involves dismantling government power at a worldwide level, including the international order, or international orders plural, because governments are still a threat to these guys. And above all, they have to slow the roll of China, which is basically set to kind of outgrow and outproduce the dollarized world. Don't think of this as a battle between, capitalism and communism or anything like that. This is a battle, as it were, between rent extraction as first economic principle versus production as first economic principle. That is what's going on. So if you take that as your lens, and that's what I'm going for, I think a lot of what you have been seeing on the international stage recently starts to make more sense. Take Greenland as an example. You had the Trump administration doing a lot of saber rattling, saying they're going to invade Greenland, they're going to invade Greenland, and it made absolutely no sense from a strategic level because we already control Greenland through NATO. But, at some points, you could kind of make a fascist argument. Okay, they want the resources and whatever. We didn't seize Greenland. What we did was, through that saber rattling, we destabilized the international order. We delegitimized the United Nations. And its replacement, which came up at the same time, was the Board of Peace, this thing that was supposed to be, rebuilding Gaza, or however they pitched it, which is basically a big old new international order with Trump as its center and kind of extracting money like a big old mafia scheme. That was Greenland. To understand Greenland, you have to understand what you thought was the side effect, which was the destabilization of the international order. Oops, we broke the world. That was the intention, or at least, I don't know if these people even are real masterminds. It doesn't really matter for these. But you have to read the goal as being, they were trying to break the world, and the saber rattling about Greenland was just their way of doing that. They didn't really care about seizing the resources. Also, Venezuela, to step back a month. Venezuela on my lens it was certainly not about stopping narco-terrorism, but it was also not about getting more oil. No, really, it wasn't about getting more oil. What happened? What really happened with Venezuela? We blew a bunch of stuff up. We decapitated the government and to some extent destabilized the region. These are things that the bros like. But then we left the regime in place. And clearly there was a deal. This was a shakedown. Trump got basically a big Qatari bank account controlled only by him with a ton of money in it. So, again, think mafia and you'll be on the right track. And meanwhile, Venezuela started sending their oil over to Israel. Why Israel, you ask? Why not to us? If we're just out for the oil, why not send it to us? Because these days, the U.S. actually produces most of its own crude oil. 60% of our crude oil comes from domestic sources. Almost 90% comes from North America. So the U.S. doesn't really need a lot of international oil in the way that Israel does. Because remember, Israel has alienated everyone in the region beyond like Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. They're pretty much their only trading partners as far as oil goes. And us. And Russia. But back to Venezuela. More importantly, the shakedown and sending Venezuelan oil off to Israel denied that oil to China, and that's important because China was by far Venezuela's biggest customer. China generally bought around 70 to 80% of Venezuela's oil exports, which amounted to last year 6.7% of China's oil imports total. So what we just did in Venezuela, looked very fascist. We were going to seize the resources for ourselves or whatever. That's not what happened. What we did was, the big headline was, we shook down the country for money, and also oil for Israel, and we starved China of those resources. That was the move. Sorry, I'm going to take a little sip. I am having Armagnac today. The importer, Voss Selections, I think, were the folks who broke the Trump tariffs. So, a little celebration. Okay, that's background. Let's talk about Iran. What the hell is happening? What's interesting about Iran is there's barely any official story. It's all, they're insisting there is one, but if you sit them down and try to get them to explain it, they don't really have one. It doesn't really make sense. If the goal with this strike in Iran is to deter terrorism, that makes very little sense. If the goal is to keep them from getting nukes, it makes very little sense. And they've also, by the way, pitched absolutely no evidence to that effect. If the goal is trying to liberalize the country and free the populace, I don't believe it for a second. Not with these guys. And it also makes no sense. If you wanted these things, there's an easy way to do that. You just make the Obama deal. You just do the JCPOA again. There were indications Iran would have been okay with it. You go over and you say, hey, Iran, we will take some of our sanctions off because the sanctions were, crippling the economy. We will take some of those off. In exchange, will make some kind of arrangement with your nuclear program, and also maybe you could do a little bit of liberalization. And hey, if you've got some mean old terrorist cells running around in Lebanon, here or in Lebanon, you maybe tone that down a little bit. That would have been the deal, and Iran absolutely would have taken it. And we didn't. We just bombed them instead. So I don't believe the story about nuclear negotiations for a second. And by the way, no, neither did Iran. They knew what was up. So the problem is, if that was not the point, why do this? Unofficial stories, the distraction from the Epstein files. I don't believe it. There's easier ways to do this. Bernie Sanders came out with a theory that basically Saudi Arabia and especially Israel pushed us into this, and I have my doubts. Like I would believe that they pushed Iran up the list because there is a list, but no, I mean this was clearly a part of the policy plan. Nota bene, footnote, on the list. Don't forget Cuba is out there. So, I mean, Cuba is not really a huge oil producer, but they are a major supplier of nickel and cobalt to China, so battery stuff. So they're absolutely on the list. And I would not be shocked if some members of the administration, like Rubio, probably wanted to do Cuba before they did Iran. But yeah, I could see some kind of story about the Saudis and Israel pushing us towards Iran first. Anyways, so let's try to construct some kind of real theory as what's happening. I think the place to start is Trump's admission in a couple of places that Venezuela was a template for this, which makes total sense. And it has to do with China. The key thing to know, I think, is that Iran was by far China's largest oil exporter last year. 23.3% of China's oil imports came from Iran last year. So that's already huge. It's already, if your goal is to starve out China, to slow their roll, so you can basically break the world and suck out the money, then it's really, really important to kind of stem the flow of oil to China coming from Iran. Even beyond that, though, is the Strait of Hormuz, which Strait of Hormuz is largely controlled by Iran. I mean, Oman as well. They've got the other half of it. But, I mean, Oman has basically like a tenth of Iran's military. And, yeah, I mean, but more than that, I mean, Iran's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, mostly. The vast majority of it does. But also, Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia do as well. And they together account for another 40% or so of China's oil imports. So, if the U.S. can shake Iran down and also kind of strong-arm those other folks at the same time, all those other Gulf states moving oil through the states, basically control all the oil going through the Strait of Hormuz, even in an indirect ways, to make sure it doesn't get to China. Then between that and Venezuela, the U.S. would have control of 70% of China's oil imports. China would be down to Russia, who, by the way, you know, Trump has obviously been buttering up in various sorts of ways. They'd be down to Russia and Angola, I think Guyana, a few other tiny sources. Now, true, it is true that China has been aggressively converting to green energy, but this would still hurt them. Like losing 70% of your oil sources, that's bad, and that would slow their roll. Which I think is that is the goal for the bros. So if that's what I think the goal was, and if Venezuela was the template, then the goal, then what this would have looked like, what they would have been planning, the way they would have hoped this would go, would be you destabilize the region because chaos is a ladder. Remember your Game of Thrones. You destabilize the region. You shake Iran down. You maybe get some money out of it because money, you know, Trump likes money. And above all, you starve China of resources, especially oil. So I think the plan was you decapitate the leadership. You kill Khamenei rather than kidnapping him. But, you know, unlike with Maduro and Venezuela, but still, you decapitate the government. You terrorize the country. You scare the shit out of everyone. And then you extract concessions from the regime and you just declare victory. There was an article, and I will try to remember to link it up down below, in Ynet last night, which is apparently an Israeli paper. I don't know much about it, but interesting article. And basically, it pointed out that the Trump folks seem to think this would be like a 4 or 5 day operation tops, maybe shorter than that. And it pointed out they basically sent a ceasefire proposal. Trump did. The Trump administration did. They sent a ceasefire proposal through a third party, apparently Italy, immediately after the first strikes, which would have been right after killing Khamenei, right? So they wanted to bomb the shit out of the country, kill the leadership, and then immediately have a ceasefire. And if that sounds crazy, it's not completely. I mean, as late as last year in the 12-day war with Israel, Iran has been incredibly reluctant to escalate. They clearly do not want to be, in a big, long, protracted war. At least then. So it made some sense to think that, after a strike like the U.S. just did, they would, the U.S. would basically get its own Delcy Rodriguez again, who would be willing to kind of play ball and maybe throw some money at them and keep oil from hitting China. So I think that was the plan. This is my theory. And of course, where things went sideways is that Iran did not take the ceasefire. They did not play ball. Indeed, Trump has said, and a couple of times, they killed too many of the leaders. They killed like 49, and including they accidentally killed the ones they wanted to be in charge. So yeah, this has gone very sideways. The shakedown has failed. The shaky is fighting back. Iran has been absolutely hammering U.S. and Israeli bases and assets, which we just kind of apparently forgot that were there and vulnerable. And now Hezbollah in Lebanon has joined in, and it's a big old giant mess. The plan, if I'm right and that was the plan, that's completely failed. Now what is the big question? And this is I've been puzzling over that first half for a few hours, and I'm just speculating a little bit about this second question. Now what? I mean, the best thing I can do is think about what happens when a mob shakedown crew fails in their job, when the shaky fights back. I think what happens is in as lazy a fashion as possible, because they don't want to spend time on this. They're going to try to punish the shaky and everyone connected to them. So, I mean, don't expect an invasion or ground war, which I guess is the silver lining here. I mean, literally, look at a terrain map of the area around Tehran. It is a death trap. If a ground invasion would be a disaster, but I don't think that's going to happen because it's just they don't want to spend the resources. These people. Instead, expect basically Gaza-style tactics. We're going to spend at least a few days carpet bombing cities, military and civilians alike. We're going to be killing thousands, and the U.S. will, in the process, absolutely lose a ton of money and equipment and troops, and the bros won't care. In fact, they'll be happy because they like chaos. They won't be as happy as if they'd gotten control of the oil supply. And maybe kickbacks from the new Iranian leadership, but they'll still be happy. And from there, from those first 2 days, I think there's a few directions to go. Really, two big ones. First possibility: we just declare victory and leave. There are. With no clear goals, there are no clear standards to meet. So Trump can just say, we won, we're in control of Iran now, everything's fine, and, piss off. And that, I think that's the most likely scenario, and maybe the best scenario, if that's possible here. Second possibility, we keep trying to control oil coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. And in other words, we move on to some kind of plan B to accomplish that same goal. And if it's option 2, if we're still going to try to control the strait and all the oil coming out of it to China, I think this gets very, very, very ugly because we're probably going to start attacking tankers. 1980s Iran-Iraq war style. We'll be targeting and pirating or maybe destroying oil tankers coming out of Iran. Like what we did with Venezuela, just on a much, much larger scale. We will cut Iran off the worldwide oil market. More than they already are. Basically cutting off the worldwide market is cutting them off from China, because China was their biggest customer by miles. And we will do that in parallel with, again, strong arming the other Gulf states into compliance as well. They will also be forced not to send oil to China. Although I don't know if they'll pitch it that way. They'll say it some other fashion, but that's what they'll be going for. And if we go this route, option B, I think it'll basically run in parallel with further and further Gaza-style tactics. We'll bomb everyone we can bomb. We will blockade and starve out the country by sea and by land. We will cut off roads. We'll basically reduce Iran to a hellscape while we kind of control the oil flow. Again, I do think this is the less likely option, but when I said in my Gaza wine video over on the other channel, when I said there that if the situation in Gaza wasn't stopped, that it would become the future of the whole world, because that's historically kind of been the case. Everything goes through Gaza. This is the kind of thing I had in mind. But wherever this goes, I want to remind you, at least if you buy my Brotalitarianism theory, that this isn't ultimately about American power or America getting great, because the bros don't care about America beyond its usefulness as a weapon against the world and as an agent of chaos. This is ultimately about making as much of the world open to extraction as possible and keeping it that way for as long as possible. And what we America have put on the table of the world over the last 2 months is, now countries can assassinate and kidnap political leaders, and by the way, they can indiscriminately bomb everyone and everyone as a means to achieve their goals, our goals, whatever, rivalry with China. And that's not just what we've already done. It's not just murder of resistance or terrorist non-state leaders. It's not just collateral damage, which you might still justify. We're talking about killing state leaders and bombing, civilian populations outright as a goal. That's what we Broligarchs are doing now. David Ricardo wrote, "The interest of the landlord is always opposed to the interests of every other class in the community." And we now have, effectively, Omega landlords, the bros, running the world. And now we are attacking Iran on their behalf. And God help us all. That's the video. That's the pitch. That's the theory. Thanks for watching, and go with God.